Hello again, and welcome to the next edition of Canadian Genius. So, after finishing filming Emotion earlier today, I was kind of debating which topic to go to next, because, as always, there's just so many. And I thought that it might be really good to take a moment to kind of look at some of the other aspects of humanity, because there really is so many pieces that we get into trouble with. And I was debating which one, because there's a number of big ones. And I kind of thought that maybe the next one we should talk about is things like sexuality. Now, late last night, I was looking at adolescent sexuality because I wanted to know what the current trends were, right? Like, what age kids are typically losing their virginity, what age kids are typically having sex at, all this stuff. And generally, the studies, at least in North America, the US and Canada specifically, show that there are kids as young as 13 having sex. It's not uncommon for 15-year-olds to be having sex, at least having it once, but the average age that everybody sort of enters the sexual world tends to be about 17. I think the statistics were like 41% of 17-year-olds were now sexually active, right, on average. And a lot of people look at stuff like that thinking a combination of things, like that's okay, that's bad, that's and I thought I would take into some of that into account and talk about all of this stuff because it all has a bearing on who we are. As I was talking about with celebrity, when celebrities lose it, they tend to go to drugs, sex, or power trips, right? Well, we're no different. We just don't really do power trips very well because they don't work. Do you know who I am? No. Oh. It just doesn't have the same impact if you're not a celebrity. But drugs and sex, absolutely. And we sacrifice a tremendous amount for these things. And the actual looking at the brain and how it relates to this stuff, we all do it for the exact same reason, right? Drugs and sex are used, alcohol too, because it's a drug, are all used because it allows our brain to disconnect from itself, right? The emotional component, the accountability sense is housed in certain parts of the brain, and drugs and alcohol, they kind of cut it out. And if you're promiscuous enough, it cuts it out too, right? Because you can lose yourself in the hormones and the endorphins and all this stuff. Because at the end of the day, I mean, even endorphins have that effect. I actually knew when I was in junior high, there was a teacher at one of the other schools that was in the city that I was in, and they would run every single day. Doesn't matter if it was midwinter, didn't matter if it was pouring rain out. And they were addicted to that endorphin high. So they would run to the point that they would get that high kick in. And it just caused all sorts of trouble because when you get to that kind of level, then you're at an extreme. And I keep saying it over and over and again. It's about balance. And everything is. Drugs are one of those things that we have a lot of issue with because there's everything in drugs, right? There's prescription drugs, there's over the counter drugs, there's illegal drugs, there's abused drugs, there's like drugs is just a too big of a term, right? Alcohol is a drug, smoking is a drug, like all of these things. But we tend to think of drugs, we always tend to think of like illicit drugs, negative effect, life ruining. And that's always kind of confuses things, but it all kind of goes together with part of sexuality because we don't use these things to better our lives, right? We don't go out and typically have sex with people because we like who we are. I mean, that's what we tell ourselves, but look at how many times it's happened, right? Even in TV and movies, what do we see, right? People go out partying, they go and have sex, and then they regret it the next day. That's the stereotype that we live by. And a big part of that, as always, is because we're not willing to be ourselves, but we're not willing to look at that bigger picture. And that's why I thought sexuality was good, because the fact that we have all these kids that even at 13 are starting to be promiscuous And a society that says in equal measure that that's okay and that's bad causes conflict. Now, in North America, we actually have legislation that if a 13-year-old is having sex, it's a direct violation of law. We call it stat rape. And it's very one sided because it's always the male that's doing the rape. But realistically, both are, right? If you have two 13-year-olds consenting to have sex, they're legally raping each other. And we don't ever look at it that way. And we need to. Because if we're telling kids that it's okay to have sex, but it's illegal, and not just illegal, like life ruining illegal, then we have to acknowledge that. And what's really fascinating, if they talk about sex in schools and of the kids that are actually allowed to even partake of it, not once do they typically talk about stat rape because they just don't want that information out there. But it's very important because that's all part of our sexuality, right? If we, if you are a 13-year-old that wants to have sex, I mean, it's a whole different world, you know? And it's really hard to understand. And part of that is if you actually do the research, the very last component of our minds that develop as we're going from kids to adulthood is the ability to understand the consequences of our actions. That's the very last thing to develop when we're about 21. So we have all these kids that, get into this position where everywhere they go, all they see is sex, right? TVs, movies, advertisement, everywhere. And it's amazing that even in like some of the more family friendly things, you still see some of that. They don't show the bits, but they're still showing the action, right? They're still showing that this is happening, even though it doesn't show it happening. And so, what a surprise that we enter this world where sex has become so critical, right? Like, we're even to the point that, growing up, if you're a virgin, you get mocked and ridiculed. And the stupid thing is typically by other virgins who just don't want you to know that they're a virgin. But it's something that we should be celebrating. It's something that we should be, telling kids that waiting is awesome. Not trying to fill their head with the idea that if you're not getting laid, you're useless. Because that's exactly what we tell boys, especially, right? It's not uncommon to even hear little, I even have heard it in like 10-year-olds and 6-year-olds and stuff talking about, some of the things that they've heard the adults talk about and dealing with sex. And they don't know what they're saying a lot of the time, but they're mimicking them. Right? And we need to understand that. We need to realize that our impact, because of what we're doing and because of our issues and our desires and our unspoken fantasies that we often do speak about in other ways, are affecting them. And it has a major developmental issue on our sexuality. As I was looking through the stats, like I said, on adolescent sexuality and stuff, it was amazing that one of the factors that had an impact on boys having sex was whether or not their mothers were married. So if they had both parents together, boys and girls tended to be less likely to go out and have sex at a young age. If they were divorced, it more mattered what the mother did after the divorce had an impact. So if the mother immediately kind of went out and slept around, their kids are far more likely to do the same thing, the boys. If they weren't seen to be promiscuous, if they didn't have dates over, if they didn't seem like they were going out all the time, their kids were more likely to wait. And it's amazing that, like, nobody has probably really put those things together. Like, I only found out it because I happened to research it. It's not something I see openly talked about. And there's lots of different variables. But one of the other big ones was that if you sort of set this parental standard that having sex later is the only option, that it's not okay to have sex until you're of a certain age. And I know there was another thing on that, just as a quick sideline, where there was an issue, like, instead of saying that you shouldn't have sex until you're, like if you say you shouldn't have sex till you're older, that doesn't really mean anything. It's like, you shouldn't really be having sex until you're 20. That's a more obtainable goal. But those standards are what we need, right? To say to kids that it's not okay. And that's not what we do. Most parents kind of go hands off with sex, right? Like I just even said earlier in this video, we don't even allow a lot of kids to go do sex ed at school because we have this demented mindset that if they don't know about it, they're not going to do it. Well, that might be true, but where in the entire universe that we have living at the moment can you possibly go where you don't see it? Right? It's like, I don't want them to know about sex. Well, let's watch a movie that has sex in it. Let's open up this magazine that's selling sex, right? Almost every product uses sex to sell a product, right? So it's really kind of demented. We don't want them to know about it, but yet we surround them with it, right? And the statistics on the youth of our community encountering porn is just scary. But I used to joke that anytime, like if you search for just about anything, you'll come up with a million sex sites. And my joke was that you should never use the plural, never add the S, because that was S was referring to sex, right? So if you looked up dog, that was one thing. You look up dogs, you're getting dog sex or something because of the S, right? Not entirely true, but it's not entirely wrong either, right? It's just absolutely amazing. And it's no different than with makeup and clothes and fashion. It's not about being good to our children. It's not about being good to each other. It's about selling a product. It's about manipulating people into buying it, right? And porn is big business. It's just as big as makeup. It's just as big as fashion. It's just considered less appropriate. But it's everywhere because we allow it, right? It would be very easy, and like we have all this cyber technology, like browsing extras and stuff, parental control things that are supposed to keep some of this stuff away, but that only works if that website acknowledges that it's an adult-only site, and not all do. And one of the reasons is because a lot of them are hosted in other countries where they have no legislation about it. Same with gambling in that sense, right? So they don't have to. And so there's nothing that you can do because it's going to be proliferated. But all of that stuff, because we don't have that conversation and we don't talk to kids about sexuality because we're nervous. We talk about sex, but we don't talk about sexuality, right? We don't talk about the drive to have sex. We don't talk about the emotional feelings of sex. We don't talk about what it feels like when your hormones are just going completely wild, right? You don't see men that are the ragers of the community talking to other men about what it felt like when they raged out because they didn't get laid, right? You never see that conversation. We see the thing, we see the men raging out, but there's no conversation after. And it's because we're kind of this double mindset, right? That sex is good and important and sex is bad and dirty. And it's really funny because I think part of that stems from the way we view girls, right? Like it's kind of like when girls are little, we expect them to be beautiful little princesses and treat them like babies. And as they get older, then they're innocent and pure. And as they get older, then they become slightly less innocent and pure, but they're still amazing and they're still fairy-like, and then they become sluts. Right? As long as it's not our kids, as long as it's not somebody we know, that's kind of what we expect of our girls, right? And it's because we're not prepared to acknowledge amongst ourselves what it is that we feel and what it is that we do and what it is that we acknowledge. And there's a show on Netflix. I don't remember the exact title, but it was something like Are All Men Pedophiles? And it's a little disconcerting to watch because of the title, but it's a really good thing to watch because there's good information in there. But that's kind of what we need to do. Like I said in the other video, right? We have all these parents that think no adult male could have any interest in a little girl unless it's sexual. And then we're wondering why they feel like they're sexual objects. Hello? They just got told they were, right? Like, get away from him. Well, why? He was nice. No. We're teaching girls that and kids internalize. So when we do that, we're telling them they're the ones that are wrong. Even though it's not what we mean, that's what we're saying. And it's because we're ashamed of that part of ourselves. But yet, we flaunt it. So that dichotomy is part of the problem. But it's important to realize that, as with human, sexuality isn't set in stone, right? Everybody's different. Some people identify more as asexual. Some people identify more as bisexual. Some people are drawn to the same sex. Some people to the other sex. Some people to strange things, right? There's all sorts of fetishes. There's all sorts of fantasies. And we never, ever, ever, ever have that discussion, especially with young people. Which is why I thought it would be good to have this video, at least somewhere in the series. Because even though I'm not talking about specific fetishes and fantasies and all this stuff, I'm still saying that we all have that stuff. And I think it's important that it exists. I would like to have that conversation. I'm just not sure how to make a video about it that would still be appropriate for all ages, right? Because even though surrounding everything, we still have rules of society that we have to follow. We still have these ideas that, like, certain things are age appropriate and certain things are not. Like, even on YouTube, you can find a lot of that adult only content, and then it just gets sort of put behind this age verification thing, which unfortunately is easy to bypass, but it puts it in place so that they're kind of not liable for it, right? But because it is so easy to include adult content and just not say anything, because like I said, like, if you build a website, there are actually special tags that you can use that specify this as adult content, which is what those net minding, net parent, or whatever programs you want to call them, that they use to say this is adult content because they've identified as such, right? Or it has a domain name like ends in XXX or something, right? We know that that means that that's a bad thing for little kids. But at the same time, because a lot of parents, especially a lot of parents are into some of that stuff, what happens is it's on their computer. Like, it's not uncommon to hear people go to porn sites and end up with all these pop-ups all over the place, right? Because that's kind of what they do. They put this malware on their system so that keeps happening, so you keep coming back. And it takes a lot to get rid of it. That's not a good thing when you have kids, because if they go on the computer and it pops up, they're seeing it, right? And especially when some of it is considered deviant, right? You see sex in the movies, sex on TV, it's all logistically impossible for the most part. I know I've seen it before where people are criticizing, the guy taking the girl up against the wall and talking about how anatomy just does not work that way and you'd have to be built a whole different way. But that's the point, right? We're still showing normal sex. Only in very rare cases are we showing deviant sex. And nowadays, what we consider gay is becoming more normal. It's becoming more acceptable. So it's being seen more, right? We see men and men kissing, women and women kissing, and all this stuff. We may not have as many steamy love scenes, but they are coming. And that's important because it says that that is okay, right? To be of that sexual orientation is okay. But then, like I said, when people get into some of the deviant behavior, and that is very subjective, because some people, like, for example, some people have shoe fetishes. And as fetishes go, I don't see that myself as being, like, the worst thing in the world. Like, that's pretty minor. Like, it's a shoe fetish. Like, unless they've got, like, some fungus or something on their feet that went in the shoe, I don't really see too many issues with that, right? Like, it's not... I mean, there may be a lot more to it than I realize, because I don't have that, but, it just doesn't seem like it's a bad thing. But yet, on the other extreme, we have people that are, say, having sex with animals. And you will never hear in sex ed class anybody say, that happens, right? It's something that kids learn really quickly, because when it's a deep, dark, taboo secret, it's important to share it because it's got that shock value, right? And that's what kids do. So someone's going to hear about it. Well, in Mexico, they do that. It's going to get out. Because look at your own life. I'm pretty sure at some point we have all heard that story, and it's typically always out of Mexico. or some of the stuff out of Germany involving scat, which is poo. We've heard those stories, and we've heard them because it does happen. How often, that's another story, but all it has to happen is once. But because we're not prepared in and of ourselves to admit if we're even interested in that kind of stuff, right? Most people with some of those fetishes and some of those fantasies, they may share it with a partner, but they will not talk about it. And that's one of the reasons, too, that a lot of people that have some of them feel so isolated. And when you're alone, that makes it really bad. And that also leads younger kids, as they develop into sexual beings, to get into trouble because they don't know the rules. They don't know what's okay, right? It doesn't, like, a perfect example is a lot of them, the autoerotica, I think it's called, the asphyxiation, like choking yourself out to have as you're having sex and stuff. Kids die from that because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what's appropriate because who would ever tell them? Who would ever have that conversation? And as I said, like, as parents, like, nobody wants to have that conversation. I know myself, my wife and I, we actually went online and we found a book about sex for kids. There's about 3 of them, I think, in the series, and each is meant kind of for a different age range. So at 6, my daughter fully knows what sex is. She's actually said many times that she wants her mommy and daddy to have sex so she can have another baby brother or sister, right? And it's not uncommon. Like, at least once a month we hear that from her because we taught her and taught her that's okay. But that didn't touch on sexuality. That just talked about sex. She's 6, right? And as I said, if we know that kids are going to have sex by the time they're 13, right? Even if your kid is the odd one out, and it's always somebody else's kid that's the odd one out. It's our kids too, right? That we need to kind of prepare ourselves for that as parents and as society. But because we see sexuality as a deviant behavior in itself, it's why we don't talk about it, right? So again, it's kind of a catch-22. That's why I thought it would be good. Like, I wasn't sure how far to take that. Like I said, I mean, providing a couple examples of extremes, that's one thing. But talking about all the different fetishes and all the different things, I don't know what level is appropriate, what information is appropriate. Because I want this to be open that, a 5-year-old can listen to it and not get devastated by it. A 20-year-old can listen to it and learn from it, right? So just the fact that we have all these different desires, we have all these different feelings, we have all these different tendencies, it's okay. Because, like I keep saying, and I'll say it again and again and again, anytime we tell ourselves that something is unacceptable, then it's unacceptable to look at, it's unacceptable to discuss, it's unacceptable to change. And we can't do that. So we have to give ourselves permission that our sexuality is okay and that we're allowed to do things that maybe aren't what we would classify as normal all the rest of the time. Not because we need to, but because it's part of exploration. One of the things I think people don't really get is how much of life is about experimenting and about experience. And we lose a tremendous amount of life if we've never done things. And for me, that's actually one of my big regrets. Like, I'm one of these kids that, I wasn't trying to be a goody-goody. I wasn't trying to be different. I just know better, right? I've seen the impact things have had on other people. So I've never had an interest in smoking. I've never had an interest in drugs. I've never had an interest in alcohol. I come from a very long line of addicted personalities. So I'm not interested because if I start, I'm not stopping. But I saw that. But I look back and I regret that I never did that. Like, in absolute truth, I didn't even lose my virginity until I was 25. Because, like I said before, I mean, I was shy. I didn't even start overcoming my shyness until I was like 21. So for me, that was probably a pretty big accomplishment back then. But I regret the fact that I wasn't promiscuous as a kid. Now, because I've never been promiscuous as a kid, I don't know the consequence, right? I didn't get somebody pregnant. I didn't get an STD. I didn't get all this stuff. I don't know what that's like. But because I don't know what that's like, I feel like I missed out, right? I don't want to do it, but we get something from that experience. And we sort of look at kids as it's okay to do that, right? We look at college as the experimental years where there's a free pass to go and do drugs and sex and alcohol and all this other stuff. We pray to God it's not going to be our kid, but at the same time, we kind of give them that free pass. And we have to make that understood that sexuality is a part of who we are. And for some people, that gets out of hand. Everything is about balance, and sexuality is important too, right? And my philosophy has always been very simple in that regard. If it doesn't hurt anybody and it doesn't cause any harm, then go for it. Which means ourselves too, right? Like, if you're into something that hurts you, like, there's a difference between a paper cut and amputating a finger, right? A paper cut hurts, but it doesn't hurt you, right? It doesn't change your life. It doesn't alter your view of yourself. It doesn't other people's view of you doesn't get altered from it, but other behavior does. And so there is a point of not sharing it, but there's another point of hiding it, right? And that's a big difference, because if we hide it, it means it's bad. And if it's bad, it means we're bad because we feel that way. Instead of just not talking about it, right? Or going and finding other people that we can talk about and not have that worry. Which is one of the nice things about modern technology, is that no matter what you're interested in, there's somebody else that's interested in it too. Typically lots of people. It's not ever just one or two. But that's exactly what we think, because we never see it. We never hear about it. We never talk about it. But there's always others. And it's amazing when you start looking into some of them, how many more there are. Because most people might think, well, okay, there might be, 50 or 60. And it's like, yeah, 1,000. Because that's just our perception. But that's all part of being human, right? There was a time when sex was very restricted in our evolution, right? Like, looking back at the history of North America, especially, who were the first people to come over? The Puritans. And they were very repressed people. They were very religious, very, like, nothing ever come of anybody being free and open and having spirituality or, sexuality. And, I mean, Salem witch trials came out of them, right? What a surprise. But the fact that we have these feelings, the fact that we have these urges, and the fact that 13-year-olds are having these urges, that's part of who we are, right? It doesn't mean it has to be who we are. It's a part, right? I know there's a whole bunch of experts that have looked at relationships and said what's kind of important. And I think most have kind of agreed that it comes down to three main things. You have to be attracted to the person, you have to be sexually attracted to the person, and you have to be able to talk to the person. Because all of those three things matter. The rest is superficial, right? If you're not sexually interested in the person, then you're not going to have that kind of relationship. And for some people, that's fine, right? If you identify as asexual, that's what you want, right? But if you're not, then you're always going to feel deprived, and that's always going to come back and bite you, right? So you have to feel like you're sexually interested in the other person and vice versa. You actually have to want to have sex with them. If you go to somebody and you're attracted to them, like, oh my God, they're amazing and gorgeous, and then something about them just says, like, ew, right? Maybe the way they talk, or maybe they, go on about their 50 other ex-lovers or whatever, right? It's like, I don't want to be a part of that. That's not good either, right? But out of the three, the ability to communicate is most important, because it's the one that's going to last, right? You have to have that relationship when you're younger, but when you're 80, most 80-year-olds have much lower sex drive. Doesn't mean they have no sex drive. There's a lot of people in old age homes that hook up, and we go, ew, Yeah, when you're you're not going to be going, ooh, you're going, it's easy to judge when we're not the ones involved. Not so easy when we are involved. But we need to acknowledge all of this, right? And we need to stop hiding it. We don't have to go and say, well, I'm interested in this and I like that. We don't need that. But we need to say, hey, I am a sexual being. I like the things associated with sex. I identify as some of these things. And it's okay. It's becoming much more okay to be straight, to be gay, to be bi. There's even this thing I've seen called omnisexual. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I can imagine what it means, but I haven't actually checked it out. Or pansexual. That's another one. Like, you have sex with utensils? But they're just different terms. They have meaning. I just don't know what they are. Myself, I do much more identify as asexual, right? Actually, in reality, in my own life, even right now, I actually have a testosterone deficiency. So I've never been, like, for me losing my virginity at 25, I suspect that I've probably had a testosterone deficiency for a long time, or at least I was on the very low end of the spectrum. Because one of the things I find really interesting is that it's not uncommon after I get the testosterone shot that, like, the next day or something, I'll actually have sex dreams. I don't ever have those, right? That's unusual for me. And I think in some ways that that's a good thing, because looking at how big sex has become, partly because we don't talk about it, right? And if you don't talk about it, it's bad, that causes issues and all, like, it just gets out of hand, right? But if we talk about it, then sex can kind of go down to this normal level and not be abnormal, which is where a lot of us still think it is, especially in North America, because we're descended from Puritans in part. But the fact that, like, for me, never really having this, like, I get, I'm attracted to women. I don't look at men. I am a different kind of person in the sense that I really think it's important to kind of balance masculinity and femininity in everybody. So it's like the idea of actually sleeping with a male to me is just not acceptable. Not because it's unacceptable, because it's just the way my brain is wired. But at the same time, it's not something my brain rejects, right? It's a little bit more complicated. It's hard to put into words, but, like, I really can't see myself in a in a bisect or a same sex relationship because there's issues. But I have experienced times where I think I can understand some of that. Like, I think there's a point in time where, like I said, because I lost my virginity at 25, and there's a point where I think your brain starts wandering because you're not finding the attraction that way. So then you start kind of looking others. Like, I have never seen a guy that I think looks like, I look at guys, I see a bunch that are, like, really quite attractive. There's no sexual draw, but I can think they're attractive because I'm okay in who I am, right? I know that, like I said, I'm an emotional person. I know I've got quite a bit of feminine traits in me, and I'm okay with that. And maybe that is partly because of my lack of testosterone. I don't know, right? It wasn't something that we found out until, I don't even think it's been a year now that we've been doing the shots. I think it's been a lot less than that, like maybe 6 months. So, but for me, that's kind of important because it has a lot of bearing on when I look back at my life, right? But the fact that I lost my virginity at 25, in many ways, I look at it as going a good thing because I didn't waste my life. But as I said earlier, in many others, I look back and regret it because who knows where life would have gone had I done it. And I think that's an important thing with sexuality, is that just like kids in general, we have to experience things to know what we're into and what we're not. And that means sometimes putting ourselves in situations that we deem as unacceptable. But as long as it's safe, as long as nobody gets hurt, and as long as nothing is wrong in the grand scheme of the universe, we need that to be okay. Because we can't be okay as human and say sex is bad, right? We can say certain types of sex is bad because it hurts somebody, it causes harm, right? It hurts an animal, it hurts a person, like having sex that involves amputating fingers, that's never okay because that's harmful. The fact that the person is consenting to it, it's still harmful. That typically means that there's another psychological component that's being kicked in. There's issues, there's other things messing with it. Because we as humans don't need to destroy ourselves. That always comes because of issue and dysfunction. And a lot of those dysfunctions typically around our sexuality or our inability to be sexual beings, our inability to have those fantasies, right? I know there's a lot of women that have fantasies about being raped. Now, the fantasy is one thing, the reality is a whole nother. And we accept that, right? We don't want necessarily to have that conversation, but that's not unnormal, right? I don't, like, I think there was research done recently. I saw the statistics and looking at like how often men and women think about sex. And it was amazing that I think about half of the time men are thinking about sex with men. Right? So most people are attracted to the same sex. They're attracted to the opposite sex. They're attracted to other things, oftentimes because there is no reality to them, right? But that's okay because that's how we explore, right? You don't get good at something by never trying it. But like I said, there's a vast, vast difference between trying something that's harmful and trying something that's experimental. And we have to give ourselves that permission. We have to be cautious. We have to be careful. We have to be prepared. But we're allowed to do that, right? And the more that we do it, then things become more normal, which is where some of this stuff becomes more useful. Like I know there's a bunch of singers that are doing more fetish-based things, right? I know I was living in another city and they have the fetish ball every year. I've never gone because I just couldn't bring myself to go because it's just like, partly because then I'd be seen, right? Well, then you'd know some of my, no. So I just couldn't do it. But I had lots of friends that were big into that stuff. And I think looking back that those are wonderful things because they help you explore, right? There is a point of it's nobody else's business and that's okay. But because they're becoming more mainstream, it makes it okay that we're doing them. But everything has to be about balance. If your whole life is about sex, you don't have a life. Right? If you think that you're not a man unless you've slept with 50 women, you have no life. Right? Everything is about balance. And you have to realize that because sexuality is individual, it doesn't matter shit what anyone else says on the subject, including me. Right? If you're a 15-year-old girl and you're a virgin, celebrate. If you're a 30-year-old virgin, celebrate. Because there's obviously something going on. Right? And it's not something to be ashamed of. Our society is so messed up because we're not allowed to be ourselves. So that's why that's an issue, right? It used to be the norm. Now it's an issue. But that's because of us. And we have to accept that, right? It can't be always a bad thing. Because realistically, if we look at the statistics and the people that do wait later to have sex, the majority of them either felt they weren't ready or they didn't find the right person. Not that they just couldn't find anybody, right? That's never been an option on the test. That's just not the way we are. And that's important because there's a difference between I'm not ready, I didn't find the right person, and I just didn't want to pay for a hooker. Right? There's a big difference between those two. And sex, for most people, has no emotional attachment because they have no emotion, right? So for emotional beings, I think that's a big reason I wasn't, like I certainly had hormones, but they were never out of control like that. And I think, like I said, because I might very well have had low testosterone my whole life. It's too bad we didn't know about that 40 years ago. Oh well. But I think I turned out pretty good, all said and done. I have fetishes, I have interests. Doesn't mean I'm a bad person or a different person. It's just the way it is, right? I still identify more as asexual than anything else, but Doesn't mean I don't have interests. It just means that's the way I am. So I hope that makes everybody feel a little bit more comfortable in their own skin, right? It's okay to do these things. You just got to do them the right way and make sure that you're safe and make sure it's in balance, it's in harmony, right? Because if you need to get wasted to do it, that means it's not good for you, right? And if you can do it wasted, you can get to doing it sober. You just need courage and permission. And that's what I'm kind of hoping some of this will give you. So right now, this is the longest video so far in the series because it did get meandery. But I hope that gives you information. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do for the next one. I think I might do the dualistic mind, that opposing mindset, because it does kind of connect with that too, right? That, like I said, sex is good, sex is bad. You know, sexuality is okay, it's evil. Like, we're built for that. So that might be the next one. I'm not sure yet. I'll decide and make it the next one. I don't think it'll be tonight. I think I'm going to get a little too late to do more. This is number 4 for today. So, and they've all been at least half an hour long each. That's a lot of a day. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.